Oh, Michael.
Thank you. You all can hear me okay? Because of some travel and some childcare things, we are joining you from Panera Bread in the American Midwest. So I do apologize if it's a little bit noisy, but I'm doing my best to make that hearable. Let me just set up my screen 1 second. Okay, so here's Zoom. I'm going to share. Sorry, I'm a verbal processor, so when I do things like this on my computer, I kind of have to narrate what I'm doing. Okay, so is it true that everyone can see my slide? But yeah, okay, cool. So thank you guys for inviting me. I really appreciate the invitation. I had planned to be there in person, but due to some family obligations, wasn't able to make it the last minute. What I want to share today is sort of a ultimate culmination of years of different studies that I've done, and I'll kind of cite those in a second, but intersecting examinations of social control, specifically as it affects social movements, and specifically as it's framed around discursive reality. It actually dovetails extremely well with the previous two speakers. I start with, a kind of series of little pictures of theorists I imagine many of us are aware of. Starting from the top, we have Foucault, Mbembe, Agamben, and Butler. Because although I won't talk about their work in any explicit sense, their work clearly informs what I'm about to discuss. And if you go and read the actual works that are developed from the publications, they're pretty heavy throughout. So I can kind of begin there. This is sort of, again, a series of publications that I've done, which all surround this issue of social control. And this is kind of the summary of it. So I first kind of acknowledge the interconnections with the previous speakers, and that what I hope you will see as obvious through lines when discussing these issues, specifically around things like cultural hegemony, discursive control, and the kind of attempted recuperation of rebellion and resistance for social control, which our last speaker summarized quite well. These are key themes that I'm going to talk about, as well as the kind of biopolitical surveillance. And again, while this is based on the kind of biopolitics or the biopolitical theories of Foucault, Mbembe, Agamben, and Butler, in writing these pieces, I really tried to author a series of texts that were accessible to, I guess, what we would call practitioners, which in this case are demonstrators and organizers. So, these are not meant to be overly academic interpretations. These are meant to be accessible, and I'll kind of lead us there, but these are meant to be accessible interpretations which are useful for us taking back discursive control. And it should be acknowledged that although this is entirely based on a US case study, we see here is occurring in lockstep in most of the Western world. I can cite a bunch of examples, specifically in Canada and the UK, which are really quite similar, or eerily similar, we can say. And by background, I work as a kind of scholar and organizer in the service of social movements. So I work to kind of train activists and train collectives specifically around issues of security and threat modeling and developing movement strategy and the use of technology for defense. So this is the space in which I'm, always in. What I want to kind of share today is to chart a genealogy, in a sense, of a discourse of control, more so than kind of make any aha. And so we're going to look at a series of events between roughly 2017 and 2020, because again, I want to have a bit of hindsight when talking about these events. So just to kind of move into the content a bit more, what I want to look at are kind of repressive cycles. We can call them epochs or eras. And again, I've done this over a longer timeline, looking back at so-called COINTELPRO era, and then interpreting this largely through lenses you probably are familiar with, namely the kind of broad work of Michel Foucault as it comes in Discipline and Punish, just speak about how the state kind of shifts its ability to control from hard or monarchical power to soft or self-policing disciplinary powers, our first speaker discussed. So the kind of repressive cycles in which the state appears to favor, within these cycles, the state appears to kind of favor one means over another. So I sort of artificially split up the last 30 years into these kind of three eras. Terrorization, that based on terrorism rhetoric; felonization, that based on the kind of over application or broad application of felony prosecutions; and riotization, this kind of notion that everyone in the streets is a rioter. So these are the kind of three broad discursive markers I'm making. And as we all know, in doing these things, the dates are not arbitrary, but the lines being drawn are to some degree kind of arbitrarily drawn. So that looking at the terrorization is sort of the late 1990s, apexing at around 9/11. So this would be like the era of the so-called Green Scare in the United States and the UK. The felonization is kind of the post 9/11 era of social movements trying to make sense of themselves, and a lot of these really felony trials in the United States. And the kind of riotization in the Trump era, this notion that everyone's a rioter and people are being treated through a specific discursive regime. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. Again, if we want to look farther, which is warranted, we can look at the COINTELPRO era, the counterintelligence program led by the FBI in the United States. This is a clear example of what Foucault would label monarchical power, the kind of heavy-handed state repression, murdering activists in their beds sort of power. And again, this is kind of followed by an increase in movement infiltration and this conspicuous surveillance, the so-called disciplinary power, which is kind of followed by re-condemnation of activists as rioters, which I will argue is monarchical power. So what I'm kind of looking at is the way in which state power sort of changes and shifts throughout these times, depending on the prevailing political conditions. And again, we'll look at a few examples of this, but I want to kind of walk through these three broad eras. So starting with this kind of what I would call terrorization, and again, this is obvious to the point of being trite at this point, especially with the hindsight of 20 years. But in the kind of post 9/11 era in the United States, we have this period of kind of naming and shaming to establish this kind of discursive power regime, right? Us versus them, freedom lovers, freedom haters. I mean, George W. Bush did a lot of things, but one of the things he did is make this kind of argumentation quite plain and simple, is that he wasn't a very coded speaker. We have a lot of these obvious markers. Looking at social movements on the left more specifically, we can look at a serious spike in repressive means targeting mostly anarchists, animal rights activists, and environmental activists. So we see really sharp increases in the state's use of federal grand juries, pervasive electronic surveillance, again made very plain by the Snowden leaks. We also see long-term infiltrations, specifically the exposure of long-term police infiltrations. This has been the subject of a number of studies that I and other people have done, looking at how police intentionally slept with, married, and in some cases conceived children with activists in order to gain trust. Again, speaking to a UK audience, you guys are probably more familiar with this than the normal folks I speak to in the United States, because this has been exposed so widely in the UK, thanks to the work of some great reporters with The Guardian and the so-called Spy Cops case. But we see during this period in the post 9/11, again, federal grand juries, pervasive surveillance, long-term infiltration, and we start to see individuals being charged with the crime of conspiracy, which again exemplifies kind of Foucault's disciplinary power, this notion that we kind of foster, quote, docile bodies which are pliable. Certainly being labeled as a federal defendant in a conspiracy trial makes you quite, again, to use Foucault's words, pliable. I don't want to belabor the point, but it bears discussing a little bit about how 9/11 set the stage for this, in that it allowed the Department of Justice to really frame any form of political dissent, or what we would later call political extremism, as a form of terrorism, right? As something designed to inspire fear and terror. And so I have a couple examples here, right? The Maclean's, which is a Canadian publication, kind of shows a pretty standard framing. If people have seen the recent BBC series that just came out a couple of days ago about the so-called Green Scare era, it is really exemplary of this. I don't suggest it, but it is brand new and hot off the press. We can also see it in terms of the way in which certain legislations are passed. Again, I'm kind of doing an intentional kind of quick review of these, but we have, for example, the Animal Protection Act kind of changing in 2018 and being recoded, in 2008, as the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, the AETA, which basically took the same measures of criminality and added in the kind of rhetoric and framing of terrorism. Again, the language of the law is quite the same. So we see that 9/11 kind of sets the stage for this. And again, this Greg Walden quote is exemplary, but there really are so many examples of kind of how the rhetoric of terrorism is used to criminalize social movements that I don't want to belabor the point. Then we have this kind of series of the use of terrorism rhetoric in this kind of post 9/11 environment. And again, I'm really taking just only a few examples here, In 2007, and again, I realize it's outside the realm of study, we have a really interesting case in the United States, which is collectively known as the Republican National Convention 8, the RNC 8. This is a case in Minnesota in which people are prosecuted under the Patriot Act. And they're charged, they're organized a mass demonstration to disrupt the Republican presidential convention. Again, a non-violent civil disobedience act, disruptive, yes, terroristic, certainly no. And they were charged with conspiracy to riot in furtherance of terrorism, which, if you think about it, again, just rhetorically, is kind of a bizarre charge. I'll read it again, as conspiracy to riot in the second degree in furtherance of terrorism. In that, rioting is itself a terroristic act. And they were also charged with conspiracy to commit criminal damage to property in furtherance of terrorism. So again, this injection of terrorism where it needed to be as a framing within criminal prosecutions. Fast forwarding, 12 years again to 2019, we have a really interesting case, which is shown here in the kind of darkish image in the middle. Appalachians Against Pipelines, which is, as the name implies, an anti-pipeline group. Blocking the development of some pipelines in the Midwest. We had people who chained themselves inside, again, classic civil disobedience. You'll notice they have concrete-filled tires here, and the pink thing is the ventilator. It's gross inside of oil pipeline, as you imagine. And so people chained themselves to the excavator. People blocked inside of the pipe. And 2 members of Appalachians Against Pipelines were actually charged with threats of terroristic acts and a felony property destruction charge. So again, the idea that committing civil disobedience by locking yourself in a pipeline and telling everyone about it as loudly as you can is terroristic really perverts, both on the linguistic and discursive level, what the notion of terrorism is. And again, there really are just a lot of different examples of this that you're welcome to look at, from the kind of Antifa as terrorists, the eco-terrorist debate, to the kind of both sidism of ISIS and the left. These are all a lot of really good and interesting markers of this. Lost my mouse. Okay, here we go. There's a couple other really giant ones. The other one is the kind of domestic terrorism legislation, which still is proceeding through the courts. This is particularly interesting because it kind of does something that I wouldn't say us, but the so-called kind of liberal or left-leaning part of the United States has been asking for, which is basically people have been saying, what about the right? Why aren't people treating the right with the same attention as the left? Well, this bill kind of tries to put them there. It kind of refocuses the kind of terrorization rhetoric on the right. So I would argue that this is not good. Like this is not a progressive step in the right direction by further extending this terrorism logic to both the right and the left. But it does get a lot of liberal folk where they wanted to be, which is finally the DOJ and the FBI is in a sense being asked to take the right-wing terrorism more seriously. So again, this is sort of the product of a lot of liberal hand-wringing, and has probably gotten us where we don't want to be. There's a few other, again, interesting examples I'll highlight. One is the 2018, and actually, if you look almost any year, the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security publishes this chart where they list a number of different incidents in terrorism. If you review these, you'll notice that there are anarchist marches and really, again, classic social movement, like the second event, for example. You have pretty classic social movement gatherings and events, which are kind of reframed as, again, something that needs to be discussed in a terrorism threat assessment. Some of these are arguably terroristic threats, but if you scroll through the list, it is quite a diverse list. Again, here are some other kind of examples. Unfortunately, the image in the lower right no longer exists. It was one of my favorite examples of this. This was, and you can go to the Wayback Machine and play with this. This is cve.fbi.gov. It is a hilarious example of a kind of counter-radicalization or counter-violent extremism website. It used to be run by the FBI until a couple years ago. It again breaks down, as you can see, kind of domestic or violent extremist group. The explanation of what these groups entail is really an exercise in bizarreness. So I would challenge you to go to the Wayback Machine and check this website out. Called "Don't Be a Puppet," and it includes a marionette image that animates as you go from slide to slide, just to make it real obvious. But anyway, these are all kind of the examples of, again, activists broadly defined being tracked and reported as terrorists, and we have lots of examples of this. So I'll provide one more before I move into the next era. This is, again, an FBI strategy guide, which was leaked. This has been shared a lot. You can see the kind of ranking of terrorist threats. Some of this is redacted, but you can see right down yellow on the bottom, we have anarchist extremists listed as a counterterrorism threat. Again, in an era in which anarchists are not acting in a way that would warrant that. And then again, when you look at the strategy guide on the right, this is the first time we see the use of this term racially motivated violent extremists, which is kind of people concerned with race when you look at the actual definition of it. This was leaked in 2019. Okay, so once we kind of move past this kind of terrorization era, then we can kind of move into this what I would call a felonization era, which is an era in which, as the name implies, more crimes are being treated as felonies. In other words, more crimes are being treated as those which would warrant long prison sentences. So there's, again, lots of examples of this. What's really interesting is the rapid passage of kind of anti-protest laws. So starting in January of 2017, so early in the Trump era, we have 19 US states announce legislation to limit protests. And within a year, this expands to 30 states and 62 bills. I'll show you a mapping of this in a little bit. A lot of these are driver liability laws. Yep, thank you. Which means that basically drivers aren't liable if they crash into civilians, or blocking road laws, which say blocking roads is the same thing as blocking critical infrastructure, or riot laws, which is where we'll kind of end up. There's also a number of criminal cases in which, again, people are charged with felonies, whereas normally they would have not been charged. The earliest kind of exemplary case is the 2017 Chase Ironized case at the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock. It's a really interesting case worth looking in, which again has some of these kind of sexual infiltration angles to it. We have a number of cases throughout the anti-pipeline campaign. And then one of the really interesting ones is this 2019 Greenpeace case in which people were charged with disrupting critical infrastructure with a terrorism enhancement. For the sake of time, I'll just speed through a couple more examples. If you look federally, these are the three pieces of legislation in the United States: the so-called Unmasking Antifa Act, the July 2019 Antifa as Domestic Terrorism Act, and the August 2019 Confronting the Threat of Domestic Terrorism Act. These all use the same discursive logic. They're all worth reading, just from a kind of, again, rhetorical point of view, not from an actual interesting point of view. So finally, where do we end up? Well, where we end up now is kind of period I would argue is called riotization, where again, in a broad sense, the state has kind of overly used that term to reclassify lots of different crimes as riots. Here's four random, not random, but here's four different examples, which I'll kind of proceed on the next slide. I want to make the point that, again, going back to this kind of both sidism, this isn't just being used against the left anymore. As this strategy has kind of metastasized, it's really focused on the right and the left. So this image in the lower right from the United States Attorney's Office in Virginia is charging folks involved in the Unite the Right rally. So these are folks involved in the Rise Above movement. And so here are just some cases, again, that folks can look up on their own. We have the Sacramento 2016 case. There's a whole mess of them. Again, the right-wing cases are interesting comparatives in that we have cases involving Proud Boys, the Rise Above movement, and Joey Gibson's Patriot Prayer, in which people are basically, agitating and assembling in public, but that agitation and public assembly is being recoded as rioting. And because it's being recoded as rioting, it allows the kind of naming and shaming of individuals. Again, the best example of this, the example that kind of got me writing about this was the so-called G20 case. This is the arrest and prosecution of more than 200 individuals, myself included, who were prosecuted for potential life sentences for disrupting or attempting to disrupt the presidential inauguration. Everyone was charged the same way. Everyone was charged with riot, regardless of individual liability. And the state was very much, if you were there, you were part of the mass, and the mass is guilty. And it was a really clear, again, rhetorical use of this idea that the riot is a single opaque entity. If we look nationally at riot legislation as of now, we see that anti-riot legislation, or legislation that says that public assemblies constitute a riot, have now been considered in 94 different instances since 2017 across almost every state, so 32 states and the District of Columbia. Thankfully, say what you say about liberal politics, but thankfully 74 of those have been defeated or they expired in the legislature. 8 of them are still pending, but 12 of them have been enacted in the United States. So there are some states which some of these laws have actually taken effect. Here are some of the kind of highlights of them, and I realize I'm heading through this relatively quickly, just because I want to get to the conclusion on the next slide. But you can see that in a number of states, it either criminalizes the wearing of masks, or it criminalizes a number of people, or it criminalizes the damage to property, or it criminalizes the disruptive nature. In some, a lot of these laws basically say, if you disrupt commerce, if you disrupt the flow of capital, that you are engaging in a riot. And again, strategically, I think that's really interesting, because a protest that's not disruptive to commerce, in my view, is not really a protest. So that would make all forms of dissent and public protest riots in some of these state laws. So where does that kind of leave us? So I think it leaves us as kind of a new direction for struggle. The image on the right is one of the raising images around the J20 case, which was used to raise funds for defendants. But I would say, for one, is it provides an interesting intervention for discourse and rhetoric. For one, there's a need for us to kind of reclaim some of this language. Again, the use of terms like militant and criminal, I think, are extremely important. I think those are terms that people shy away from maybe needlessly. I really like using the term militant, not in its relationship to the military, but in terms of its kind of side taking. So I look at like Nancy Shepherd Hughes, the idea of a kind of militant anthropology, the idea that like there is no objectivity in some of these forms of scholarship. I also think this, good protest, bad protester narrative is something we really need to work on collectively as a group. In other words, not throwing our allies under the bus when they are using means which don't match our own personal politics. Again, the J20 case is a really good example of that. When the so-called Women's March, basically like leveraged, all of our prison sentences to another. Anyway, but my point is that not falling into the trap where demonstrators are used to demonize other demonstrators seems like a really big takeaway from what we've seen over the last 20 years of this rhetoric being used against us. Two is that, there is a limit to what legislation can do to protect freedoms for people to assemble, for sure. But I do think that some of these dangerous precedents need to be fought, specifically at the lower court level. The federal legislations, I think, are symbolic and performative and not that important. But some of these local state-based legislations are really regressive and really damaging. And people should pay more attention to those. To that end, people interested in US law can look at a website called Protest Law Tracker, which covers these on a state-by-state basis. That's where that image came from of the United States. And three is that because the state is constantly changing and reinvent its means of social control, we need constant experimentation, innovation about street tactics. And this kind of idea of fight, claim, and hold space is outdated. And I think the Hong Kong and Floyd protests have shown us that. But we need to continue to kind of adapt to that. I'll pause there. Let me put my email address. Yes, this is me. I'm, like I said, based in Cincinnati and Washington, D.C. My email address and whatnot. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions, and I thank you all for your attention.